For millions of years, the human brain has been hardwired for one basically inescapable default. We create gods. We are biologically programmed to seek out purpose, to sense invisible agents in the dark, and to perceive some sort of higher power. It's actually a fundamental survival tool. But this deeply ingrained evolutionary mechanism has birthed a massive, glaring paradox that we're going to be diving into today. Over 500 million people, really let that number sink in. If our minds are basically factories, perfectly designed by evolution to produce religious belief, how on earth do hundreds of millions of people fundamentally override their own human nature? Why does widespread atheism even exist at all? The thing is, believing in gods is like an evolutionary downhill slope. It's totally frictionless, it's intuitive. Atheism, on the other hand, is a steep, brutal uphill battle against our own biology. It implies that rejecting those deeply ingrained intuitions, the ones that feed faith, requires immense cognitive heavy lifting. But is disbelief really just a matter of trying incredibly hard not to believe? Let's look at the 4 suspects, the pathways to disbelief. Okay, to solve this mystery, researchers have essentially profiled 4 distinct suspects, 4 unique ways the brain's default programming gets disrupted. But before we meet the first one, we have to understand a psychological superpower called mentalizing. It's basically your brain's ability to simulate the hidden thoughts, intentions, and wishes of other people. When individuals pray, their brains are actually hijacking this exact same social circuitry to speak with an unseen mind. Enter our first suspect, mind-blind atheism. If your brain naturally possesses a slightly weaker mentalizing radar, the whole concept of a personal God, someone who listens to prayers and has rich mental states, well, it just feels entirely alien to you. You aren't aggressively fighting against religion, your brain simply struggles to process it intuitively. Our second suspect is driven entirely by survival. Call it atheism. Historically, human suffering, disease, and a brutal lack of control drove people to seek the comfort of the divine, right? But drop humans into an environment of extreme existential security, with advanced medicine, stable governments, long lifespans, and that primal, desperate need just evaporates. You become indifferent to heaven because your earthly life is already secure. Now, to understand our third suspect, you need to know about something called creds. That stands for credibility-enhancing displays. Think of these as the painful, costly, highly visible proofs of faith. If a parent preaches about God but never sacrifices their time for church or rituals, a child's brain automatically registers a lack of creds. To a developing mind, actions literally always speak louder than theology. And this triggers suspect number 3, incredulous atheism. In this scenario, disbelief is simply inherited. It's not some grand rebellion against intuition. It's just the quiet result of growing up in a world totally devoid of sincere, costly displays of faith. The brain simply isn't convinced the supernatural actually matters. Our final suspect is probably the one you know best, analytic atheism, the classic rational skeptic. This is when deep analytic processing forcefully overrides our gut religious biases. Bizarrely enough, research shows that even tiny psychological prods like reading a hard-to-read font or just staring at a picture of Rodin's sculpture The Thinker can trigger this analytic circuitry and temporarily spike religious skepticism. So, there's our lineup. Mind-blind atheists whose brains don't intuitively grasp supernatural minds, apatheists who are just too secure to need them, incredulous atheists starved of cultural proof, and analytic atheists who literally think their way out of faith. But when we test these 4 suspects in the real world, who is actually responsible for the massive global rise in disbelief? Which brings us to the plot twist, the empirical data reveal. To find the true mastermind, researchers ran a massive, nationally representative study in the United States. You might naturally assume that logic and deep analytic thinking forge modern atheists, because, that's the narrative pop culture absolutely loves. But the cold, hard data tells a surprisingly different, incredibly compelling psychological story. It basically came down to a battle between 2 scientific frameworks. On one side, cognitive byproduct theory, which argues that raw analytical brain power is the ultimate weapon against faith. And on the other side, dual inherence theory, which argues that we are purely products of our environment, that cultural exposure dictates our belief. When the numbers finally came in, the result was a stunning reveal. Witnessing fewer credible cultural displays of faith, what we call low creds, was the undisputed heavyweight champion of predicting atheism. It totally annihilated cognitive reflection, and mentalizing barely even registered a pulse. The critical factor isn't how deeply you ponder the universe. It's whether you actually watch the people around you act as if God is real. Just to put that dominance into perspective, low cultural exposure predicted a mind-bending 90% higher odds of atheism than having a peak cognitive reflection score. Let me say that again. If you want to predict if someone is an atheist, you shouldn't test how logically their brain works. You should look at how their parents behaved on a Sunday. And the plot thickens even further here. Existential security, that idea we talked about where safety breeds atheism, it predicted absolutely nothing in this specific US sample. This violently isolated cultural learning as the undisputed primary driver of religious disbelief. So let's explore this cultural learning twist. So what exactly happens to our famed analytic atheist? Is logic completely irrelevant? Well, not exactly. Here is the brilliant psychological twist. A reflective cognitive style only predicts disbelief if a person's cultural exposure to religion was already pretty low to begin with. If you grew up surrounded by intense, massive displays of faith, your analytic thinking simply cannot overpower that conditioning. Logic essentially requires a cultural vacuum to take root. Now, what does this mean for the future of faith and disbelief? When these theoretical pathways collide out in the real world, they create entirely new social landscapes. Take the scientific community, for example. Analytic thinkers flock to science, a subculture already basically devoid of religious displays, creating a massive closed loop of non-belief. Or look at Scandinavia. They have near total existential security, meaning they don't need gods for safety. This naturally leads to fewer public displays of faith. Add in high science education, and you have this cascading psychological domino effect, where atheism becomes the absolute cultural norm. Ultimately, the data reveals a profound truth. Atheism isn't some forced, unnatural rebellion against human psychology. It is a naturally occurring cultural equilibrium. Our evolved, ancient brains haven't actually changed at all, but our beliefs are deeply, hopelessly tethered to the communities we inherit. For the vast majority of human history, intense cultural displays of faith were the global norm, constantly feeding the default biases of our minds. But today, as secular institutions provide totally unprecedented security and the visible proofs of religion fade in our modern cities, how will the delicate coevolution of our brains and our beliefs adapt next? Are we simply stepping into a brand new psychological chapter of the human story? I'll let you think on that.